Today's video is sponsored by Audible. I read so many scary stories sometimes that I struggle to find time to read for pleasure on my own. That's where Audible comes in. Audiobooks on the go from Audible lets me listen at the gym, while shopping, in the car, or while traveling when I otherwise would be trapped in the continuous paranoid thoughts of these spooky stories. Starting a free 30-day Audible trial lets you choose one audiobook and 2 Audible originals, and like I said, it's totally free. I've been obsessed with The Dark Web by Jeff White, an Audible original that exposes the depths of the dark side of the internet, from human trafficking to government secrets. Visit audible.com/readcreepy to get started on your 30-day free trial, plus 1 audiobook and 2 free Audible originals. That's audible.com/readcreepy or text READCREEPY to 500-500.
So this story is from a friend of mine, but I have his permission to post it here. He's told it on multiple occasions, and I swear to God it's one of the scariest stories I've ever heard in my life. It doesn't involve Bigfoot or ghosts or anything like that. It's a story of how reality can be way, way scarier than anything like that. For the longest time, he worked as a trail ranger at a large national park. A trail ranger is basically a ranger, only with considerably less judicial power. He can't arrest you or anything, but if you're in an illegal blind or hunting stand, he had the power to call in actual cops before ripping down whatever unlicensed hide you've constructed. So this one time, he's accompanying an actual forest ranger and taking down unauthorized hunting cameras and feeders. The actual ranger was an older guy who started to feel unwell towards the early afternoon, so he headed back on his own. It was like an hour's ride on an ATV, and left my buddy to finish up. Just as he was almost done, my friend starts to hear voices coming through the trees. It's important to keep in mind that he was way off the beaten path at this point, so it's not like he expected there to be anyone around. But it occurs to him that these might be the people putting up the illegal cameras and blinds in the first place. He calls out to them, demanding to know who they are, but the voices just go quiet, and there's not a sound to be heard other than the occasional bird song. It's also starting to get dark by that time, so he starts heading back towards the trail where his ATV is parked. When he finds it and tries to start it up, it won't budge. That's when he noticed that the ATV battery has been torn out and taken by someone. Not some prank by the older ranger. Someone has actually disabled his means of escape. The way he tells it, this obviously made him extremely nervous, especially since he'd already heard voices in the area. He radios back into the ranger station he's based at, basically telling them that they needed someone to come pick him up. They reply they'll have someone out to him within an hour, but when he asks about the older ranger, they tell him he hasn't arrived back yet. Again, this made him really nervous since the ranger should have easily arrived back by that point. He settled down and started a small fire as the sun went down, but before long he heard those same voices again. They're not happy at all. He said it sounded like they were in the middle of a vicious argument, with one guy angry and yelling while the other sounded frightened and apologetic. He listens for a minute or two before calling out into the darkness, asking if anyone needed help. The way he tells it, they must have heard him. You could hear them, so they must have heard them in return, but they didn't react, like they were too absorbed with their disagreement to answer him. My friend then radios back into the ranger's station for a progress report. They replied saying they were having a little trouble finding the trail he was on, but that they wouldn't be much longer. The older ranger, however, still hadn't arrived back at the station. About 5 or 10 more minutes go by when my trail ranger friend begins to hear the same angry voices start up again. He decides to walk towards them, hoping maybe he can prevent a potential assault, and maybe even get his hands on some food and water. He walked in their direction, but the voices seemed to be getting further away, no matter how much he tried to close in on them. Finally, after like 20 minutes of walking, he gave up and hiked back to his fire. It's about then that he got a radio call and they said the older ranger guy has been found passed out, covered in vomit, having fallen from his ATV. He was being taken to the hospital and that had taken priority over finding my friend. I mean, that's understandable, but my friend is getting kind of frustrated at this point. He's out in the woods, on his own, and it's getting real chilly out. Then the voices came back. He's pretty bored at this point, and he's convinced these guys don't want any company. So he said he just sat there in the darkness, listening to them argue over something. He's picking up little phrases here and there when the voices begin to shout. Things like, "Well, it wasn't yours to take," or, "I don't care, it's mine." Stuff like that. He says he assumed it was two hunters, maybe arguing over a kill, but there was a good chance they were blaming each other for the missing equipment that my friend and the ranger had confiscated. He heard the argument get louder as one of the hunters shouted something unintelligible. Then, out of nowhere, bang. A single gunshot echoes through the woods. He immediately doused his fire, ran a couple 100 meters into the trees, then hid in a thicket. He said he waited there for as long as he could stand it, hearing absolutely nothing but his own heavy breathing until he saw the lights of an ATV. He told the guy picking him up everything that had happened and they called into the ranger station. They had people looking for 3 hours out there, but not a single thing was found by any of the rangers. They came back the next day with state police and tracker dogs. It only took about an hour before a shallow grave was found. In it was a long, dead corpse of a man who had clearly been shot in the forehead. Thing was, it was a skeleton that had been there for years and years. So either the argument he heard just ended with a bang and both parties went home last night, or he heard the murder of someone from years ago. I don't really believe the last part, and to be honest, neither does he. But it certainly makes for a creepy ending to the story. But the really scary part for me is that there's every chance that the gunshot he heard that night was yet another murder, and that the body will be found in a similar way by some unwary ranger, like some horrible time loop that'll never end. I've been a hunter for more than 20 years. My dad taught me, just like my grandpa taught him, same as I taught my own son in turn. I've faced down grizzly bears, packs of hungry coyotes, even guys I suspected to be cartel tending to illegal grow sites. But they're things a man can deal with. A can of bear mace, a warning shot. Only once have I come across something I didn't know how to deal with. Only once have I ever truly been frightened. When I hunt, I take dogs. They're a pair of big old Airedale terriers, good hunting hounds, and even better company. Just from the way they're acting, I can tell if there's a bear in the area, or if we're still in the trail of that whitetail we've been tracking. Unfortunately, on the day in question, they couldn't pick up anything. I mean, that's not unusual at first. It normally takes an hour or two to really get a sense of what's been moving through the area, to kind of tune into the forest. But we've walked for hours and hours and didn't find so much as a squirrel. The woods were eerily quiet that day, so reluctantly, I doubled back to a creek we'd passed and sat down to fish. The fish, however, were not so shy, and I managed to get one on the hook in record time. One of the joys of hunting smaller game is actually being able to eat whatever you've killed right there and then, and nothing tastes as good as fresh fried fish. So I tie my fishing line off on a tree, letting my dinner hang there in the evening sun while I get to work building a small cooking fire right there next to the lake. It took a little longer than I had liked thanks to recent summer rains, but soon I'd had the tinder crackling with smoke and flame. Then it was just a case of gutting that fish and tossing it in the pan with some Crisco. Gutting a fish is easy, but it sure ain't glamorous. Sometimes you pull out a parasite or two that's attached itself to the gills or guts. Just one or two normally, but this thing had a mess of them in its belly. Its shimmering insides were black with writhing worms. It was sick, real sick. I tossed it on the fire and washed my hands off in the creek. I'd never seen anything like that in all my years. But I wasn't scared, disgusted, sure, but not scared. Not yet, anyway. I kicked some dirt on the fire, whistled the dogs, and began to walk back to the car. I decided that I'd make a point of stopping by the park ranger's station to tell them about those parasites I'd seen inside the fish. Only, I never made it to the ranger station. My dogs are real good boys. They know not to make a lot of noise out in the woods, lest they scare the game away. Most I've ever seen them make noise is a kind of muted yapping whenever there's a grizzly in the area. So when we're about halfway back to my truck, one of them lets out this string of loud, angry barks. My first thought is that it's another person out here with another dog. Trigger is a friendly boy, but he barks up a storm whenever he sees or smells another hound. I tell it to hustle up, but he just keeps on barking for a moment or two before he did the weirdest thing. He slinks back towards me, tail between his legs, whining and yapping like I hadn't seen him since he was a puppy. I reached down to pet him, and he was shaking like a leaf. Then, out of nowhere, he just peed right there on the ground. He didn't cock his leg like he normally does against a tree. The poor guy just let loose, almost like he didn't mean to. That's what got me thinking. What is it that had Trigger so scared? Whatever it was close enough for him to catch the thing's scent, big enough to make him freak out like that. I had no intention of hanging around to find out what it was. I started walking back in the direction of my truck, a little faster than before. The dogs were bounding back and forth, barking into the woods behind us and yelping at me as if to say, "Hurry up, old man." I kept wheeling around with my rifle pressed into my shoulder, ready to fire at some mama grizzly who decided I was too much of a risk to her babies. But nothing came. I didn't even hear twigs snapping, no tree branches swaying. Whatever was coming at us was moving totally silently. That was around the time I began to smell this real strong scent in the air, kind of like cat pee or something, only it has this awful rotten tinge to it. I don't think I'd run like that since high school. I was exhausted when I finally got back to my truck, dripping sweat from hauling my nearly 50-year-old self across half a mile of woodland. The dogs actually tried to scramble over to me to get into the cab once I'd unlocked the door, and I may or may not have been speeding down that dirt road before I even closed the door. I couldn't take my mind off of the whole drive home, and the more I thought about it, the more it was obvious that something was terribly wrong with the woods around that area. Even in the middle of winter, when most of the birds and animals move south for warmer pastures, the woods are alive with the sounds of nature. Hammering woodpeckers, the occasional high-pitched squeal of an elk, the screeching of birds of prey from above. They're never, ever quiet. But that day, the woods were completely silent. It reminded me of a documentary I'd seen on natural disasters. Before an earthquake or tsunami, all of the animals in an affected area seem to sense the oncoming danger and flee. This has been reported time and time again by the survivors of such events. Whatever was out there, the animals had sensed it just like my dogs had, and it had scared them like the devil. I have no trouble admitting that I was terrified. Like I said, I've been a hunter for more than 20 years and nothing has ever so much as made me jump. But something wasn't right about the woods that day. Something that still makes my skin crawl to think about even to this day. I told a few old buddies of mine one time, but they just laughed and called it a campfire story. Some days I really, really wish it was. Let me make something clear. I'm not telling any of you my name, nor am I telling you where or when this all took place. Why? Because I still might go to prison for this. Whatever happened never made the papers. No cops ever appeared at my front door looking to ask questions. Not yet, anyway. Part of me thinks that day might never come, but just in case, I need to confess so I can at least go on with my life with a semblance of normalcy. I honestly don't care if people believe this or not. If people call it out as fake, well, maybe I really will get away with this. I've never been particularly active. I'm an indoor sort of guy. Less trails and rivers, more Netflix and dominoes. But my wife's family, on the other hand, are total opposites. When I married into the family, my size and athleticism became the butt of most of their jokes. It wore on me for a while until my wife made a suggestion. Go hunting with her brother. Earn a little respect. Then maybe I'd find Thanksgiving at their place a little less unbearable. So, I agreed. The 2-hour drive out into the woods with my brother-in-law was awkward to say the least. He's one of those guys who's unable to hold down any kind of conversation that strays from the NFL and light beer. However, he did seem to perk up once I'd mentioned that I'd never fired a gun before. Through wheezed laughter, he told me how it would be fun seeing the city boy try to handle the recoil of a 30-06, or whatever that meant. But I admit, I was kind of excited about the prospect of firing one for the first time. After all, I put enough time into Call of Duty, I thought. He parked the truck, then pulled out 2 big rifle slips from the rear storage. Inside were 2 rifles, big old things made of wood and iron. They were way heavier than I had expected. He wasn't wrong about how amusing he'd find it watching me fire one either. The recoil made me jump out of my skin, and the sights nearly hit me right in the eye thanks to looking into them a little too close. But to be honest, I didn't care how funny my brother-in-law thought it was. I found the whole experience exhilarating. I missed my shot on the tree stump he told me to aim at, but when I insisted on trying again and again until I hit the thing, he seemed to react exactly how my wife had assumed he would. He respected that I didn't just give up. Soon, the conversation flowed a little more freely, with considerably less jibs about me being a liberal city boy, as he so deftly put it. I don't know why I doubted her. My wife was right. He was her brother after all. Once he thinks I'm ready, we start walking further out into the woods to look for deer. He goes through the fundamentals of deer stalking with me, how to tread lightly and to stay downwind from your potential quarry. I honestly didn't think we'd see anything. My brother-in-law told me himself that sometimes luck just wasn't on your side, especially for newer hunters like myself. But we were wrong. We did see something. Through a dense patch of bushes, I saw something poking over the top, something symmetrical and pointed. I silently got my brother-in-law's attention, pointing towards what I'd seen, what was clearly a set of deer antlers. I expected him to rush into action and shoot the thing through the bush, but he just pointed at me, frantically indicating that it should be me to take the shot. So I did, just like he'd shown me. I rested the butt of the rifle into my shoulders, aligning the front and rear sights in my vision, then slowly and gently squeezed the trigger. The antlers disappeared, and on the other side of the bush, something hit the dirt with a thud. I'd done it. My first kill. I could see in his eyes how impressed he was, how rare it was for a first-time hunter to bag a buck on his first shot, let alone his first hunt. We rushed through the brush to check out the kill, but we couldn't never have been ready for what we were about to see. Blood and brain were strewed across the dirt and fallen leaves in front of us, looking almost bright among the dull color of the forest floor. And there were antlers all right, but they weren't attached to a deer. It was a woman, completely naked, lying in the dirt before us. Her body was an ashen gray, like it had been painted with mud or something. The antlers were part of some kind of headdress that lay next to her still warm body. My first reaction was to pull out my phone. I didn't think, I just acted. I wasn't thinking about the consequences. I was halfway to calling the EMTs when my brother-in-law slapped the phone out of my hand. "I'm not going to prison because of some dumb hippie," he hissed. But she didn't look like any hippie I'd ever seen. The headdress she'd been wearing had no flowers in it. It wasn't at all pretty. It was a mess of dead roots and vines with what looked like teeth and rats' tails stitched into it. Aside from that weird body paint she had on that made her look like a corpse, her fingernails were long, yellowing and sharp. After that is kind of a blur. I remember running back to the truck, being so out of shape that I stopped to puke against a tree, then more running. My head was spinning by the time we got back to the truck. We said nothing to each other on the drive back. We didn't need to. It was either keep our mouths shut, or it would be the end of our lives as we knew it. When we got back, my brother-in-law explained that I'd shot my first deer, but had freaked out and ran when I saw the body. Couldn't handle being a killer, he said. I nodded, playing along that I was too much of a baby to be a hunter, and they all believed it. It played right into their stereotype of me, and no one ever questioned a thing. No one thought it was suspicious that we came back earlier, or without the deer we'd killed to butcher for meat. My brother-in-law and I barely talk now. We see each other on the odd holiday, but the conversation never advanced past small talk. Each of us just tries not to think about it. But I do. I can't help it. I wonder which one of us is going to break first, him or me. Sometimes I worry he thinks I'm going to snap and tell my wife, that he'll invite me into the woods for one last hunting trip, and I'll never be seen again. I'm a hunter up here in Minnesota, in a town not far north of Mille Lacs Lake. I have a handful of stories detailing freaky incidences that have taken place on hunts. Here's the first. One season in particular, I was fairly deep in the woods on a snowmobile trail. When I hunt, I typically carry my .30-06 knife and pack. I feel fairly confident in the woods, but this season I had some concern. The deer population seemed lower on our property recently, and we knew there were wolves around because you find their tracks, not to mention being able to hear them howl at night. But luckily, they typically don't mess with people. But as I was scanning for deer tracks in the dirt, I found a different set of tracks that stood out to me. They looked canine, minus the nail marks, and was a bit wider. The paw on it looked like a 150-pound animal. Then it clicked that it was a feline track, a big one, and fairly fresh. I knew there were bobcats around, but they don't get that big, so the next logical step is to assume that there was a cougar in the area. I decided to double back. So I'm heading back east on the trail when my dad calls and asks me to do a push through the woods towards his stand, so I say sure. At this point, his stand is maybe 500 meters through thick woods from me, and I'm concerned about the large predator nearby, but I also know that I'm 6'4" and about 190 pounds before putting on my gear. Statistically speaking, cougars don't tend to attack healthy adult men. So I push forward. I get about halfway to the other stand when I get concerned because I lost my marker. I stop to regain my bearings, and then it hits me. Something in my gut tells me, you're being watched. Then I notice how still the woods are, deathly quiet. Then I hear a branch snap behind me, maybe 20 meters. I steady my rifle and scan in a circle, but only see trees and brush. I wait, and it's just way too quiet, so I push forward towards my dad's stand. The whole time, I'm hearing something not far behind me that's quietly keeping pace. Eventually, I stopped hearing it, and the woods went back to normal with the birds singing and whatnot. Then I stepped out onto a trail about 40 meters from my dad's stand. I suspected it was the cougar that made the tracks. My guess is that it thought I would put up too much of a fight, or it caught my dad's scent and chose to back off. I never did see it, but something definitely was following me. Second story. This happened about 2 years ago now. I decided to take my fiancée hiking after one evening in a park with some nice bluffs to climb for a great view. If I'm honest, I was hoping to see a nice sunset and earn some boyfriend points so I could drink with my buddies on the weekend without complaint. You should know that this isn't a particularly safe thing to do at this time of night, so I gave her my tactical knife and I carried a .40 caliber pistol. We arrive and park the car before heading up a trail, and then about 100 meters in, we spook what I assume was a deer, which halted away from us so quickly that I only saw a flash of tan. Honestly, it scared us pretty good too. So now I'm on edge and we round a crest in a hill and I see a black mass to my left in my peripheral vision. I unsnap the retention in my holster and turn to engage what turned out to be nothing but a mound of black dirt. So I calm down and we continue on with our nice little evening hike, with birds chirping, bugs making noise, regular forest stuff. Now for the creepy part. Once we were within 20 meters of the halfway point on the trail, it starts to feel real eerie, almost like we're being watched. This time it clicked right away. The woods are now dead, but I start noticing movement keeping pace with us, so I keep us moving towards the top of the hill, the high ground which is the halfway point on the trail. We reach it and stop. So does whatever was following us. But the woods are still dead calm, and my fiancée tells me she thinks we are being followed, so we decide to move on and take a shortcut back down the bluff to the paved trail. We make it, and the woods get back to normal sounds again. We considered hiking more, but were a bit too spooked and left the park. Now whatever was following us I suspect was another cougar. It was quiet and we didn't see it, and the strangest part is that the stalking noises it did make sounded elevated like it was moving from tree to tree, and big cats have been known to do this. Story 3, perhaps the least explainable of them all. This one happened around June or July of 2007, I believe. I was around 17 years old and much more cocky then, but still somewhat knowledgeable of the outdoors. My family used to own a cabin in northwest Wisconsin. I basically grew up there in the summer and knew the woods well, but at night it was wise to stay in the cabin or at least by the bonfire by the beach because of bears, wolves, and cougars. One of the creepiest things was if you were having a bonfire, the tree line was visible from the fire pit and beach, and at night you always felt like you were being watched from that tree line. But during the day the woods always seemed normal, not so creepy. That is until this incident. This happened in broad daylight sometime around noon. Me and my cousin were having an airsoft battle. I was in full woodland camo. He was not. I retreated onto the ATV trail into the woods for a tactical advantage, and our battle took us about 200 meters up the trail. We had enough at this point and were standing at the edge of a clearing on the trail talking, and he was maybe 10 feet from me. When I decided to mess with him, I shushed him and said, "We're being watched." He froze. Then I realized the woods were dead quiet, and I got spooked and started scanning the tree line and the other edge of the clearing from left to right when I saw it. Its teeth gave it away. It was panting and staring at my cousin. I don't expect you to believe me, but what I saw was a wolf as big as a black bear, at least 300 pounds. But it wasn't normal. This wolf was on 2 legs, crouching next to a tree with its arms grasping the tree, grasping with a clawed hand. It had reddish-brown fur. The next thing I know, we're both of us sprinting back towards our cabin. I look back at the wolf, or bear thing, which was now in the process of full-on charging us, barreling through the brush. But for whatever reason, it stopped following us as we broke out of the tree line. What struck with me the most was the sheer size. The wolf thing had to be nearly 7 feet tall when upright, and that where it should have had front paws, it appeared to have large clawed hands. No, I'm not sure how to explain it away rationally. I have heard wolves will occasionally kind of walk upright, but as far as I know, they can't sprint on 2 legs, nor do wolves get that big, and black bears more waddle on their hind legs. I still have no idea to this day exactly what that thing was. I lived in the San Jose Silicon Valley area for most of my life and have been an avid hunter ever since my dad and uncle took me along on a trip when I was a kid. Some of the woodlands out there are some of the last great wilderness areas on the West Coast, the kind of places where radio or even cell towers won't reach, the kind of place that, when you're there, you truly are disconnected from the modern world. So one day I'm out with my buddy in our usual hunting spot, which happens to be near a creek. Now, this creek is home to steelhead trout, black-trail deer, all kinds of red and yellow-legged frogs, all of which are species rapidly approaching the endangered list. But when I happen upon the creek, I find the thing is bone dry, not even so much of a trickle of water flowing through it. All the steelhead trout are dead, lying there rotting in the sweltering afternoon sun. I start to notice all this plastic and piping at the bottom of the creek where it feeds out. So I think, okay, it's probably just a rancher who needs the water for cattle or something. But regardless, diverting natural water sources like this is terrible for the land, as you probably guessed from the mention of all those rare trout just lying there, dead. I started following the plastic piping about 100 meters through the trees until I began to see this little canyon. In it, being fed by the water pipes leaching from the creek nearby, were hundreds of marijuana plants. They're short because it's early in the season, maybe only about 2 or 3 feet tall, so I can easily see these 2 human figures crouched among the plants while tending to them. Now, I've run across these kinds of operations before. They're usually planted by old hippies or small-time gangbangers, but these guys had rifles slung across their backs, pistols in little hip or leg holsters. They even had these big old knives. They looked like they could be special force guys or something, seriously not the usual people I run into at these things. The other thing I notice is the environmental damage these guys are doing. Most wilderness grow sites at least try to tidy up after themselves, especially the hippie types who generally leave nothing but their boot prints. But these guys left camp trash strewn everywhere, empty plastic bags of fertilizer, empty propane tanks, all kinds of garbage. They're unaware that I'm watching them at this point. They're still just working their plants, cruising through the grow site towards where I'm stood. That was like that oh no moment, where I realized if anything went down here, we'd have no help, no backup. I had my old bolt action and a buck knife, but these guys had AR-15s. There's no way I'd last a minute in a straight-up gunfight with them. So we just watched for a few minutes, using our deer stalking skills to remain unseen, or so we thought. Crack. There were panicked screams in Spanish from the canyon below. 1 second we're crouched among the bushes. The next, my buddy is lying flat on his back. At first, I had no idea what had happened. I thought he might have slipped and fallen, but then I saw the blood. He'd been shot by an ambusher who had been watching us just as we'd been watching them. The bullet passed through both of his thighs, completely taking his leg out from under him, causing him to pump blood out onto the forest floor. It was horrible. I had no idea if those guys down there, who I assumed were hardened Mexican cartel at this point, were on their way up to finish us off. I racked a round into my hunting rifle and fired it in their general direction, then did the same with my buddy's rifle, hoping it might deter them for a moment or two. I had no first aid on me at all. I had one back in the truck, but that was miles away. We had to think fast. My buddy was already screaming at me to cut his shirt off to make a pair of improvised tourniquets. I did so, terrified that it wouldn't be enough to stem the horrendous amounts of blood squirting out of not 1, but 4 bullet wounds. We managed to stem the bleeding a little, but I needed to get my buddy help, or there's no doubt he'd have bled to death right there on the forest floor. But as I mentioned before, we're in a wilderness area with very little in the way of radio or cell reception, so I couldn't reply on my phone to bring in the EMTs. As I ran off back in the direction of my truck, I wondered if I'd end up running into cartel growers again. It was one of the worst feelings of my life. Go slow and safely and my friend might die. Move fast and loud. Those cartel guys might have gotten the drop on me. Considering it was one of the worst days of my life, we were remarkably lucky as it progressed. Firstly, as I'm running, sweating and panting like a beast through endless forest, I heard some kind of high-pitched whooping sound. Only this wasn't any kind of animal I'd ever heard before. It was human. Sure enough, I walked straight out onto this mountain biking trail with these kids going down it so fast that they just whizzed right past me without stopping. but with breathless cries and waving arms, I did manage to catch their attention. One of them said their parents were nearby and they'd go get help, which I told the others the direction of the creek in which to send the EMTs when they arrived. Secondly, one of the worst places to get shot or stabbed is in the mid to upper thigh, which is exactly where my buddy took the bullet. The reason being is the femoral artery. It's one of the biggest blood vessels in the body. Nick that, and you're dead in minutes. That's what I feared the most, that the tourniquets had failed, that my buddy had died of blood loss mere minutes after I had left to get help. Thank God that wasn't the case. Doctors later said that the bullet had traveled through both legs without hitting anything major, which makes him one lucky SOB if you ask me. I heard a group of DEA agents join the park rangers in eradicating the marijuana patch, torched it all in one go in a controlled burn. But all those chemicals done a number on the soil where the grow site was, and that's the real crime if you ask me. I still hunt, so does my buddy, although it took him a little longer than me to get back to it. I suppose that's the allure of the forest. You never know what you're going to find on a hunt. And you never know when the biggest danger isn't some black bear who doesn't like you too close to her cubs. It's your fellow man. One particularly snowy February a few years back, I was out shooting birds in my beloved state of Michigan. I had my old German Shepherd dog with me, Jazz, who has to be the best bird dog this side of the Great Lakes. I took Jazz out for a hunt at Harrisville State Park, just a few hours north of Detroit. He was on one of those extendable leashes at first, just in case he got too excited and took off through the forest. But I bought it cheap online and it wasn't a very good one. Rather than a long strap leash, this was more of a cord or thick string. Good for a smaller dog, not so good for a German Shepherd. So, we're getting pretty deep into the woods when we come across paw prints in the snow. I'm no tracker, but they look pretty canine, so I figured it was a dog or something, but the way Jazz was barking made me think it might have been a fox. Foolishly, I was encouraging her to find the evil fox, hyping her up with my tone of voice. It was dumb because the next thing I know, she's pulling on the leash really hard and I can feel the cheap plastic beginning to bend in my grip. Then, the cord just snaps. And obviously Jazz does what dogs do and just follows her nose through the trees, completely ignoring my cries for her to stop. Although she wasn't exactly hard to follow, she made huge bounding tracks in the snow. I was obviously extremely anxious that she'd get lost. I wouldn't just be heartbroken, my parents would literally murder me if I lost our dog. There wasn't any undergrowth, so I could see him darting around the woods about 60 or so feet in front of me, smelling things while ignoring me. I'm following him, trying to get his attention. There were coyotes in the area and I didn't want him finding a den and sticking his head in. He eventually darted down a side path, an unmarked, unofficial trail that ran along the creek. I knew it fairly well, and had been on it in the summer, but this was winter, so it might as well have been another country. The creek cut through some hills, and the path was pretty much along the hilltops the creek had cut, but still, I followed the dog along the narrow, slippery pathways. That's when I hit a patch of ice. I really should have seen it coming. It was dumb of me to just go running off like that in such hazardous conditions. But you must know how it feels, thinking you're going to lose a pet. I think I'd run through fire just to catch up with that old hound. I slipped, falling in the frozen dirt so hard it knocked the wind out of me. I'm not talking about just from the impact. I really did land right on my sternum. I had to roll over. I was desperate to draw a breath, but that's what sent me rolling down that steep hill towards the creek bed. I rolled over onto my belly and tried to grab for a root to stop myself from sliding. Only when I grabbed it, I had half a second to realize it wasn't a root. It was nothing but a loose twig. So I fell all the way down the hill, slamming into rocks and tree stumps the whole way down. I'm yelping and cursing, but I got a flash of the frozen water in my eyes and began to panic. Really panic. If I was injured and I ended up in that freezing cold water, I was a dead man. The creek was frozen over, but I hit with enough force to break the ice. Thankfully, the water wasn't deep at all in that section I landed. When I tried to stand at first, my knees buckled and I went to my hands and knees. At first I thought my fears were confirmed, that I'd broken an ankle or something, but I hadn't. I was just banged up from the fall. Pretty much everything but my shoulders and head were submerged in freezing cold water. I remember screaming in frustration as I scrambled to my feet and stumbled to a place I could get back up out of the water. Jazz at least came down to see what I was screaming about. When she got close enough for me to grab her, I tied the length of cord from her side of the broken leash to my wrist. She wasn't getting away again. I'd see to that. It was around this time I noticed my pant leg had been ripped open when I fell into the creek, and so had my knee. I don't know whether it was a sharp rock or something else I landed on. Still, I was bleeding pretty good, and soon it started to throb. That's when I started to walk back to my car. It couldn't have been more than 2 or 3 miles, but I was completely wet with ice-cold water in February, bleeding and walking with a pretty bad limp. Like I said, I'm no expert tracker or anything, but I was terrified that a bear or something would smell my blood and chase me down before I got a chance to get to safety. Worst-case scenario was, of course, playing in my head the whole way back to the car. But I got there, peeled out of my wet outer layer, but I didn't have anything dry to change into. I did at least have a first aid kit handy to bandage my leg. I had the heater on full blast. I put my unfired .22 in the back seat. There was no way I'd be shooting it while it was soaked through. Best to just head home and see to getting my leg checked out by a nurse. But before I moved, I sat there for a while in the car, shaking from the cold and the realization that it could have gone a whole lot worse. During the Vietnam War, the CIA's Special Activities Division began to recruit, train, and lead the indigenous Hmong people in Laos to fight against North Vietnamese Army. This secret army was organized into various mobile regiments and divisions, including various special guerrilla units, all of whom were commanded by the United States military. Though their role was generally kept secret in the early stages of the conflict, they made great sacrifices to help the U.S. and were instrumental in the rescue of downed pilots. It's said that more than half of all the fighting-age Hmong men in Laos signed up to fight. After the war, thousands of economic and political refugees resettled in Western countries. The Lao Veterans of America and Lao Veterans of America Institute helped to assist in the resettlement of many Laotian and Hmong refugees and asylum seekers in the United States, especially former Hmong veterans and their family members who served in the U.S. Secret Army. One of these refugee families was the family of a boy named Chai Vang. Vang and his siblings relocated to the United States in 1980 and eventually settled in California. Vang lived in Sacramento and eventually enlisted in the California National Guard. He served 6 successful years with the California Guard, earning a Good Conduct Medal and attaining a Marksman-class Sharpshooter qualification badge. Vang was 32 when he moved his family out to St. Paul, Minnesota. By this time, he had followed the Hmong tradition of becoming his family's shaman, part of which was actively hunting and spending time in nature. This could be why he had chosen to move his family out to a place where the attitude to hunting was much more relaxed. St. Paul is just a 2-hour drive away from Meteor, Wisconsin, a wild area of the state in which deer hunting is particularly popular. Meteor extends over a large, sparsely populated area, and the land is a mix of public and privately owned. It was a Sunday, November 21st, 2004, when a hunting party of about 15 people were in a cabin on some private land just outside of Meteor. Terry Willers, one of the owners of the private land, left the cabin and saw Chai Vang sitting in a deer stand. Willers used a handheld radio to ask the people still in the cabin whether or not anyone should be in that stand. Upon receiving a response in the negative, he approached Vang and told him to leave the property. Vang then apologized and started moving south towards a woodland trail. A witness had later stated that Terry had said he was going to go talk to him to find out who he is, why he's there, and make sure he knows that he's on private property and that he's not welcome there. I thought this to be interesting, so we went to see what it was about to go down. A confrontation followed. One of the hunting party flipped over the hunting tag on Vang's back to get his license number. The events after the confrontation are disputed. A violent altercation broke out, and 4 of the 8 victims were shot in the back. 3 of these 4 were hit by multiple rounds. Vang is believed to have fired around 20 bullets from a high-caliber Saiga rifle, which was later recovered by police. One of the wounded hunters died the next day, bringing the toll to 6 dead and 2 wounded. Vang fled the scene on foot and discarded his remaining ammunition, later stating that he did not want to shoot anyone else. Vang eventually came across another hunter riding an ATV who had no affiliation with the victims, and this hunter offered to give Vang a ride, eventually taking him to Vang's cabin. Vang was arrested when he returned to his cabin 5 hours after the shooting. An officer waiting for Vang placed him into custody and transported him to the Sawyer County Jail. His bail was set at $2.5 million. There have been conflicting reports about what may have led to the shootings. According to subsequent oral statements by Vang, one of the local hunters, Terry Willers, took the first shot at him, and therefore the shootings were in self-defense. No shell casing was ever recovered from Willers' gun, even during the trial. Another of the hunters admitted to firing a single shot later during the incident when Vang, noticing that there were survivors, fired at him again. Others testified that no shots were fired before Vang started shooting. Vang stated that race was a factor, alleging that during the verbal disputes, some of the local hunters yelled out racial slurs at him. On the stand, Hasselbeck admitted that Robert Cruteau had called Vang a humong a-hole. The group of hunters also admitted that they had told law enforcement that they'd had problems with trespassers in the past, specifically citing Hmong hunters who often travel to Wisconsin from Minnesota to hunt. The term mud duck is often used in western Wisconsin to refer to Minnesota residents. Willers used this term to describe Chai Vang when he radioed back to the cabin. Though the term does not necessarily have a racial connotation, Vang's defense attorney argued that it did due to the fact that the group did not know at the time that he was from Minnesota. During his trial, Vang told the jury he feared for his life and began firing only after another hunter's shot nearly hit him. He detailed for the jurors how the other hunters approached him and how he responded by shooting at each one. He says he shot 2 of the victims in the back because they were disrespectful. He recounted with clarity how he killed each victim. While saying on the stand that he wished it hadn't happened, it was his opinion that the 3 of the hunters deserved to die. Vang further testified that they deserved to die because he accused me of giving him the finger and tried to cut in front of me to stop me from leaving. They also deserved to die because he had had a gun. Vang reenacted his deeds while on the stand, using his hands and arms to imitate the motions of firing a rifle. Vang's lawyers commented that some of his abnormal remarks were due to the language barrier. Therefore, when Vang responded affirmatively to the question that the hunters deserved to die, his meaning implied that the men contributed to the circumstances that led to their deaths. On September 16, 2005, Chai Vang was found guilty of all 6 charges of first-degree intentional homicide and 3 charges of attempted homicide by a jury of 8 women and 4 men. He was sentenced to 6 consecutive life terms plus 70 years, 4 for 2 counts of attempted homicide plus 5 additional years for each count of homicide in the first degree, a sentence of life without parole. At the time, Wisconsin was one of 12 states in the United States that did not have the death penalty, so unlike his victims, Chai Vang would escape a death he may well have richly deserved. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe and click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/Let's Read Official, and give and receive feedback from the community, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And join my Discord to interact with me and other listeners directly. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations for just $1 a month on Patreon, and maybe even pick up some Let's Read merch on Spreadshirt. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all these stories in long compilation form and save huge on data, located on both Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Links in the bio. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, are you a parking ticket? Because you've got fine written all over you.